It is called It is Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong, the Case for Personal Freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Judge Andrew P. Napolitano.
Thank you, my dear friends. I think I had been on the bench for about 2 or 3 days when they assigned me small claims cases. So you walk out into the courtroom, there's this many people in the courtroom, and they each want their case heard before lunchtime because at 1:30 in the afternoon you have a crowd about the same size. The typical case was the dry cleaner ruined my dress, but he also tried to pick up my sister. So a lawyer says to me, Judge, I'm going to need a translator for this case because my client doesn't speak English. Okay, what language does he speak? Italian. I call the courthouse administrator looking for the translator. She's busy in another courtroom. So I say to the throngs in this courtroom, is there anybody here that speaks Italian? Little guy in the back raises his hand, comes up. We swear in this guy to translate truthfully. We administer the oath to the witness. Here's exactly literally what happens. Lawyer to translator, give the court your name. Translator to witness, what is your name? I thought, let me see where this is going to go. All right, counsel, ask your next question. Lawyer to translator, give the court your address. Translator to witness, where is your house? I looked at this guy. I thought you said you told me you could speak Italian. He said, I can, Your Honor, but my English, she's not too good. One time I was picking a jury in New Jersey, and in most states, the judge actually picks the potential jurors. And again, you have about this many people from whom you have to extract 12 who have no bias, no prejudice, no knowledge of the facts, no interest in the outcome. This was a drug distribution case. They caught some guy at the George Washington Bridge with a truckload of cocaine. So I had a feeling that there were people in this room that did not want to be on the jury. So I said, is there anybody here that can't serve on this jury? Little lady in the back raised her hand. I said, yes, madam, what is it? She said, well, I can't be on this jury because of my occupation. I thought to myself, what could she possibly do? I said, all right, madam, what do you do? She said, I'm a soothsayer. This is 1995. Who calls themselves a soothsayer? So I fell for this. I said, all right, madam, how does that keep you from being on the jury? She said, Judge, I already know how the case ends up. I should have said, why don't you tell us now, lady, and save us the next 3 weeks in the courtroom? I have not hesitated in my work at Fox to criticize Republicans as well as Democrats when, in my view, their behavior in office has exceeded the confines of the Constitution. In fact, sometimes I got myself in a little bit of hot water for aggressively criticizing the Bush administration for things like the Patriot Act and warrantless spying and things like that. But I am in no small way largely responsible for George W. Bush becoming president. Now, I'm going to take you back to November of 2000. If you lived in Florida then, you will not forget that time period. It was the recount. As Fox's chief legal analyst, my job was to become an expert in Florida election law, something that was totally alien to this former judge from New Jersey. So I literally had to be the network expert on hanging chads and dimpled chads and what's a recount and what's not a recount. And one day I was on the air, this is towards the tail end of all this, I was on the air with my colleague Britt Hume. He was in Washington, I was in New York, but through the magic of television, it looked like we were in the same room. And we were discussing some issue involving the Constitution when all of a sudden Fox does one of those things that does about 25 or 30 times every half hour, swoosh, a Fox alert. So Britt stops the conversation with me and begins to read on the teleprompter what the alert is. And the alert is that the Florida Supreme Court has just ruled that the recount should resume, not only in the 4 counties in which Governor Bush has challenged Vice President Gore, but in all 72 counties of the state of Florida. And the Bush campaign is going to appeal this decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in Atlanta. He then goes to me and said, Judge, what do you think about this? I said, well, the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit in Atlanta simply stated does not have the authority to hear an appeal from the Supreme Court of a state. He goes, well, what should Bush's people do? I looked at my watch. I said, well, it's 5 minutes to 7 at night in the East Coast. The federal courts are closed. The Supreme Court is closed. Governor Bush's lawyers should get in their cars and they should go to Georgetown. And they should look for the personal residence of Justice Anthony Kennedy, because he is what we call the circuit justice for the southeast part of the United States. They should knock on Justice Kennedy's door and present him with a petition to stay, that is, to stop the effect of the Florida Supreme Court decision until the rest of the U.S. Supreme Court can vote on it the next day. At that point, my gig with Britt is over. I go upstairs to my office to take a nap because we had been going about 20 hours straight every day. And at 10 o'clock, I had to be on with O'Reilly. And of course, one can use all the rest one can get for an experience like that. While I am sound asleep in the couch on my office, the following happens. My ever-charming, ever-garrulous, never one to miss a beat colleague, Shepard Smith, is on. And he's talking in general about the recount, when all of a sudden another one of those Fox swoosh alert. And he begins to read the teleprompter. And the teleprompter, and he's reading, says the following. Governor Bush's lawyers have just been cited in their cars in Georgetown, looking for the personal address, the personal residence of Justice Anthony Kennedy in order to file an emergency appeal with them. And then he breaks from the prompter, as only he could do. He looks at the camera, he goes, do you know what this means? This means that George W. Bush is watching Fox. And he's getting his legal advice from Judge Napolitano. And the rest, for better or for worse, is history. All right, from ridiculous trials to serious trials. Some men say the earth is round and some men say it is flat. But if it is round, could the king's command flatten it? And if it is flat, could an act of parliament make it round? Well, those words were articulated by St. Thomas More in defense of himself in his own trial before a jury in which he was charged with treason. The alleged act of treason and the proven act of treason under the law at the time was the refusal to acknowledge that the king was the head of the church on earth. But when he was arguing to his jurors that the king can't make a flat earth round and the parliament can't make a round earth flat, he was not only appealing to their common sense, of course that can't happen, he was appealing to their understanding of the natural law, to the way the earth and the humans who inhabit it are created. And in appealing to the natural law, he was arguing something that we need to understand today, that even the King of England has natural limitations on his power. And even the Parliament has natural limitations on its power. And those limitations were ordained by the creator of the earth and the king and everybody on it. And that creator is the Almighty, whatever terminology you choose to apply to him. Thomas More was picking up an argument that had been made by Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas before him and would eventually be made by John Locke and Thomas Jefferson after him. And the essence of it is what Tony articulated just a few minutes ago. Our rights come from our humanity and not from the government. When Jefferson wrote in words that all of us know because we memorized them as school children, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he was wedding the birth of America to the idea of the natural law, that rights are inalienable and come from the creator. Well, before he wrote these words, when we were colonists, we were fair game for the king and parliament. And they had ingenious ways to raise money from us. And one of the most hateful ways In fact, it was probably the last straw in the minds of most colonists, was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that every person have in their home, on every piece of paper in the home, every legal document, every financial document, even a poster one would nail to a tree or a pamphlet one would hand to a neighbor, a stamp bearing the king's image. You think it's rough going to the post office today? You had to go to a British post office and buy a stamp with the king's image on it. Question: how did the king and parliament 3,000 miles away know if you had the king's stamp on every piece of paper in your home? Answer: Parliament enacted the Writs of Assistance Act. This abominable piece of legislation permitted British soldiers to write their own search warrants. So it was not uncommon for you to hear a knock at the door, and a very polite British soldier would hand you a piece of paper on which he had authorized himself and his troops to cross the threshold, to enter your house against your will, ostensibly to look for the stamps. Of course, while there, they might help themselves to alcohol if you couldn't prove that you had paid the tax on the alcohol. They might help themselves to furniture if it appeared that the furniture was not made in the colonies and you couldn't demonstrate that you had paid tax on the furniture. They might even decide not to leave and help themselves to the house, which is why we have the Third Amendment to the Constitution prohibiting the quartering of troops in a private residence without the express consent of the owner of the residence. This was really the last straw. It became the last straw when some very bright college students at the College of New Jersey, which later would become known as Princeton University, did some calculation, and they concluded that the cost of enforcing the Stamp Act was more than the revenue derived from it. So why would someone enact a tax and enforce the tax if it cost more to enforce it than was actually collected by it? Unless the real purpose of that tax was not to collect money, but to enter private homes and to demonstrate that the king, though 3,000 miles away, still had the same type of autocratic dominance over the colonists that he had over people in England. This was, of course, the last straw. The uproar was so extreme that Parliament rescinded the Stamp Act, but it was too little and too late. We fought a revolution against the mightiest king and navy and army then on the planet. We won the revolution. We wrote a constitution, all this to assure that what the king did to the colonists, the new government in America would not do to us. And so in 1787, every state sends delegates in rough proportion to the population of that state. Florida was not a state at the time, to Philadelphia in order to write the Constitution. And the first debate they have, again, is what Tony talked about earlier. Where do our rights come from? There was a big government crowd, yes, it existed even then, in Philadelphia, in the person of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. And they argued that because we need the government to protect our rights, we therefore can't have rights without the government. Because the government has limited resources, it can decide when our rights can be expanded and we can say and think and go and do and worship as we want, or contracted in accordance with the needs of the government. Now, Jefferson wasn't there, he was in Paris, but his argument was made by Madison, and that was, wait a minute, we just fought a war against that king, saying that our rights are inalienable and they come not from the government, but from our Creator. That was the natural law argument, same argument that Thomas More had made 300 years earlier. That argument, of course, wins the day, but in order to assure that the government would remember that our rights come from our humanity, the Constitution would have 10 amendments added to it. They're not part of the original Constitution, but they passed very, very quickly in the following 4 years. And we all know what those amendments are. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. I've often argued that the most important word in there is the. I'll repeat it for you. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. By calling it the freedom of speech, the authors, the founders, recognized that it pre-existed the government. It pre-existed the king. It pre-existed the government that they were creating here. It was a part of our humanity. So all of these amendments, your right to think as you please, your right to develop your own personality. I've also often told O'Reilly he should be grateful that that's a guaranteed right. Your right to worship or not to worship. Your right to say what you think, to publish what you say. Your right to travel. Your right to keep and bear arms. Which, my friends, is not the right to shoot at a deer. It's the right to shoot at a tyrant if it takes over the government. And that quintessentially American right in the Fourth Amendment, the right to be left alone, today called the right to privacy. Because the Fourth Amendment says before the government can cross that threshold, which the king let the soldiers cross on their own say-so, the government has to go to a neutral judge and prove under oath something called probable cause, a phrase meaning it is more likely than not that on the other side of that threshold where the government wants to go, there is evidence of crime, and there's no other way for the government to get it. That was the law, that was the culture, that was the value, that was what was accepted by Americans. Washington is elected president, and he serves 8 happy years. John Adams is elected president, and suddenly there appears throughout the country something that is inconceivable today, fear of the French. The government was afraid that Jefferson would get all of his friends from France. He was the U.S. ambassador to France in the 11 years of the Articles of Confederation. And the French people would come here and they would vote Adams and company out of office. They are the big government people, the Federalists who believe in a strong central government, and heaven forbid elect somebody like Jefferson president. So the Congress enacts something called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically says if you want to come here, you can come. We have open borders, unless you're French. If you're French and you want to come here, you have to wait 14 years before you can become an American citizen and vote. And then they added a very, very troublesome section to this legislation. It said anybody who brings the government or the president or the Congress into disrepute shall be guilty of a felony punishable by 2 years in a federal jail. Well, first of all, note who's missing from that. President, government, Congress. The vice president is missing. Who was Adams' vice president? Jefferson. Remember how people were elected president in those days. Everybody ran for president. Whoever finished first became president. Whoever finished second became vice president. Could you imagine that in the modern era? This, of course, was changed by the 12th Amendment, which put people on tickets. So Jefferson's the vice president. He doesn't want this protection. He welcomes criticism of him. But President Adams is actually going to prosecute people for criticizing him. Now, scratch your head. How could the same generation, in some cases the very same human beings who wrote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, in fact enact a law that authorized prosecution of people because of their speech? We're not talking about hate speech or obscenity. We're talking about political speech that is critical of the government. Well, a congressman, an anti-federalist, a Jeffersonian from Vermont by the name of Matthew Lyons decided to challenge this statute. John Adams was known in his 4 years as president at times for walking around in public with a purple robe on. Sometimes he had gold epaulets on the shoulders, and it looked a little too regal for the Jeffersonians. John Adams was also known to have a problem that afflicts many middle-aged men, a problem with his waistline. So Congressman Lyons stood in front of the White House, not on the floor of the Congress where this language would be immune from prosecution because of a clause in the Constitution that says the government can't prosecute members of Congress or what they say on the floor. But in public, in front of the press, such as it was at the time, he refers to President Adams as his rotundity. And President Adams indicts Congressman Lyons under the Alien and Sedition Act, and he's prosecuted in Boston, and he's convicted. And Congressman Matthew Lyons serves 2 years in a federal prison in western Massachusetts for making fun of the president's waistline. All right, now, if you're from Hudson County, New Jersey, or Chicago, or New Orleans, or Boston, you'll understand the second half of this picture. Congressman Lyons ran for re-election from his jail cell. And he won. Of course, by the time he was re-elected, Jefferson was in the White House. The Alien and Sedition Acts had expired. Jefferson said, even if they didn't expire, I'm not going to enforce them anyway. You can say anything you want about me. That's why we fought the Revolution, so that people would have these freedoms. And the government, instead of interfering with them, will protect them. But this is a very ugly lesson in our history. And I haven't yet answered the question of how the same people who wrote the First Amendment could also have enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts. I'll give you another story from the same time period. It's just 12 years later, so it's now 1812. We're fighting the War of 1812. It starts out as a skirmish between battle or warships, such as they were in the Mediterranean. It ends up with the British burning the Capitol and burning the White House and trying to take the colonies back. It's a serious land war as well as a naval war. In Upper Marlboro, Maryland, a platoon of British soldiers is marching through the town, and they kidnap 6 townsfolk. Under cover of darkness, the following night, a local militia invades where the soldiers are encamped, and they kidnap 4 British soldiers. The town threatens to hang the British soldiers. The Brits threaten to hang the 6 townspeople. So the mayor, John Hodges, on his own, no weapons, no arms, no militia with him, walks right into the captain's area and says, I'll make you a deal. We'll return your 4 soldiers, you return our 6 townfolk. Captain says, you have a deal. The soldiers go back to the platoon, the townsfolk go home, nobody's harmed. 6 months later, the war is over, the Americans win, the British go home. This town holds a tumultuous parade for Mayor Hodges because of what he did. At this parade is every state and federal official in the state of Maryland. At the end of the parade, the mayor gives a speech on a podium, not unlike this. He walks down off the podium and he sees 2 strangers, one of whom puts shackles on his hands and the other hands him a piece of paper. They were federal agents from Washington, from the Justice Department. The piece of paper was an indictment for treason, for providing aid and comfort to the enemy in wartime by returning the British soldiers. Now there is a trial in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. The judge who presides at the trial, the federal judge, was one of the speakers at the parade at which the mayor was honored. Everybody in the jury was at that parade. The prosecution stands up and says, well, you know, we all know what happened here. We don't even have to put any witnesses on the stand. Everybody in this courtroom knows what the mayor did. Defense stands up and said, yes, everybody knows what the mayor did, and what he did saved lives. The judge says, it's how different times are today, members of the jury, there were no ladies in the jury, gentlemen of the jury, go across the street to the local tavern and deliberate there. And when you have a verdict, come back to us. The 4-person raises his hand and says, Judge, we have a verdict already. The verdict is not guilty. This is the first example in American history of jury nullification. And it is a published opinion. It is a published opinion studied by law students, and it's basically farmers saying to the almighty federal government, you shall not pass. This person should not have been indicted for this crime, no matter what the technical words of the law may be. Now, the Justice Department has had a rule since day one. There's only been 7 prosecutions for treason in the history of the country. This was the first. Because treason permits execution of the defendant without the defendant having caused a death by his own hands, the Justice Department has required that the President of the United States of America personally approve every prosecution for treason. Now, what left-wing creep was president in 1812? Madison, who wrote the Constitution. So again, we have another example of people promising to do the right thing in order to get in office, and in fact doing the right thing. Madison participated in the war effort against the Brits. Madison was the scrivener in Philadelphia. Madison took the notes. Madison literally, personally crafted the language that became the Constitution. Fast forward a generation, and as president, he would authorize this kind of a prosecution. St. Augustine used to call this libido dominandi. No, not that kind of libido. This kind of libido is the lust to dominate, the desire to tell other people how to live their lives. And my friends, the great problem we have today is that this is the kind of person we have put into office. We should put into office people who will leave us the hell alone. You're at home one night, there's a knock at the door, you open the door, there's a guy with a gun. The guy says, "Give me your money, I want to give it away in your name." Think to yourself, what kind of a crackpot is this? I better call the police. Turns out, he is the police. He has come to collect your taxes. Look, there are three ways a person can acquire wealth in the Western world. One is the inheritance model. God bless you. Somebody died and left you a lot of money. The other is the economic model. You trade your sweat, your muscle, your knowledge, your talent, your skill, your time to someone who will pay you for it. The third is the mafia model. Give me your money or else. Which model does the government use? Let me get this straight. Social Security, broke. Medicare, broke. Medicaid, broke. The post office, broke. Amtrak, broke. Why, when the government took over the Mustang Ranch, because they didn't pay their taxes, they ran that into the ground. So the same government that can't supply booze and hookers to truckers in the desert wants to manage health care. And the Patriot Act permits federal agents to write their own search warrants. And we have gone a full 360 degrees from the very reason for which we seceded from Great Britain in order to become a very special place on earth where liberty and not government would reign. So we are confronted with choices every day, whether it is this monumental election coming up or whether it's smaller elections. We need to get into the face of candidates, and we need to know exactly where they stand when it comes to the primacy of the individual over the government. And we ought to vote for people who want to shrink the government, who want to keep it within the confines of the Constitution. The people are entitled to a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. And the people in the government ought to remember what Jefferson said, which is that that government is best which governs least. Now, on the 15th of October in the year of our Lord, 2012, 400 patriots assembled in a hotel room in Sarasota, Florida, in order to talk about human freedom. 50 years, 10 years, 4 years from now, will there be anything left to talk about? My friends, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its maximum hour of danger. That hour is now. We are that generation, and we must defend it with all of our hearts. Thank you, and God bless you.